and welcome to the Street Crime America's YouTube channel. Please don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe. Today we look at the life of a notorious American criminal who will never be forgotten about in the American criminal underworld. Vincent Louis Gigante, born March 29, 1928, also known as the Chin, was an American mobster who was the boss of the Genovese crime family in New York City from 1981 to 2005. Mr. Gigante started out as a professional boxer who fought in 25 matches between 1944 and 1947. He then started working as a mafia enforcer for what was the then U.S.A. crime family, forerunner of the Genovese crime family. Mr. Gigante was one of 5 brothers. 3 of them, Mario, Pascal and Ralph, followed him into the mafia. Only one brother, Louis, stayed out of the crime family, instead becoming a priest. Mr. Gigante was the shooter in the failed assassination of longtime U.S.A. boss Frank Costello in 1957. In 1959, he was sentenced to 7 years in prison for drug trafficking, and after sharing a prison cell with Mr. Costello's rival, Vito Genovese, Mr. Gigante became a capo regime, overseeing his own crew of Genovese soldiers and associates, who operated out of Greenwich Village. Mr. Gigante quickly rose to power during the 1960s and 70s, and by 1981, he had become the family's boss, while Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno served as front boss during the first half of the 1980s. Mr. Gigante also ordered the failed murder attempt of Gambino crime family boss John Gotti in 1986. With the arrest and conviction of Mr. Gotti and various Gambino family members in 1992, Mr. Gigante was recognized as the most powerful crime boss in the United States. Dubbed the Oddfather and the Enigma in the bathrobe by the media, Mr. Gigante often wandered the streets of Greenwich Village in his bathrobe and slippers, mumbling incoherently to himself. Mr. Gigante was indicted on federal racketeering charges in 1990, but was determined to be mentally unfit to stand trial. In 1997, Mr. Gigante was tried and convicted of racketeering and conspiracy, and sentenced to 12 years in prison. He was sentenced to an additional 3 years in prison. Mr. Gigante died while incarcerated at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners on December 19, 2005. Mr. Gigante was born in New York City to Italian immigrants from Naples, Salvatore Gigante, a watchmaker, and Yolanda Gigante, a seamstress. Mr. Gigante had 4 brothers, Mario, Pascal and Ralph, who followed him into a life of organised crime, and Louis, who became a Catholic priest at St. Athanasius Church in the South Bronx and city councilman. According to his brother Louis, his nickname, the Chin, stemmed from their mother affectionately calling him Cinzino as a boy, derived from the name Vincenzo, the Italian form of Vincent. Mr. Gigante graduated from Public School 3 in West Village, Manhattan, and later attended Textile High School but dropped out. He was a professional light heavyweight boxer between 1944 and 1947, who was known as the Chin. He fought 25 matches and lost 4, boxing 117 rounds. His first professional boxing match was against Vic Chambers on July 18, 1944, in Union City, New Jersey, which he lost. He then fought Mr. Chambers a second time at St. Nicholas Arena on October 6, 1944, where he defeated Mr. Chambers. He defeated Mr. Chambers again on June 29, 1945 at Madison Square Garden. His last match was against Jimmy Slade on May 17, 1947 at Ridgewood Grove, Brooklyn, which he lost by technical knockout. He maintained a residence in Old Tappan, New Jersey, with his wife Olympia Grippa, whom he married in 1950, and their 5 children, Andrew, Salvatore, Yolanda, Roseanne and Rita. He maintained his second family at a townhouse in the Upper East Side, Manhattan, with Mr. Gigante's longtime mistress and common-law wife, Olympia Esposito, and their 3 children, Vincent, Lucia and Carmela. As a teenager, Mr. Gigante became the protege of future Genovese crime family patriarch Vito Genovese, who had helped pay for his mother's surgery. Between the ages of 17 and 25, he was arrested 7 times on charges ranging from receiving stolen goods, possession of an unlicensed handgun, and for illegal gambling and bookmaking. Most were dismissed or resolved by fines, except for a 60-day jail stay for a gambling conviction. During this time, he listed his occupation as a tailor. In early 1957, Mr. Genovese decided to move on the U.S.A. family boss, Frank Costello. Mr. Genovese ordered Mr. Gigante to murder Costello, and on May 2, 1957, Mr. Gigante shot and wounded Costello outside his apartment building. Although the wound was superficial, it persuaded Mr. Costello to release relinquish power to Mr. Genovese and retire. Mr. Genovese then controlled what is now called the Genovese crime family. A doorman identified Mr. Gigante as the gunman. However, in 1958, Costello testified that he was unable to recognize his assailant, and Mr. Gigante was acquitted on charges of attempted murder. In 1959, he was convicted with Vito Genovese of heroin trafficking and sentenced to 7 years in prison. He was paroled 5 years after. Not long afterward, he was promoted from soldier to captain, running the Greenwich Village crew and headquartered at the Triangle Civic Improvement Association. In 1969, Mr. Gigante was indicted in New Jersey for conspiracy to bribe the entire 5-member Old Tappan, New Jersey police force to alert him to surveillance operations by law enforcement agencies. Though that charge was dropped after Mr. Gigante's lawyers presented reports from psychiatrists saying that he was mentally unfit to stand trial. Since 1969, he has been treated 20 times for psychiatric disorders, and his primary treating psychiatrist, Eugene D'Amato, noted that Vincent Gigante has been diagnosed since 1969 as suffering from schizophrenia, paranoid type with Peroud acute exuberations, which result in hospitalization. In 1981, Mr. Genovese's successor, Philip Benny Squint Lombardo, stepped down as boss due to poor health. With Lombardo's support, Mr. Gigante became boss of the Genovese crime family. Anthony Fat Tony Salerno was made front boss of the Genovese family in order to fool law enforcement. He built a vast network of bookmaking and loan sharking rings, and from extortions of garbage shipping, trucking and construction companies seeking labour peace or contracts from carpenters. Mr. Gigante also had influence in the Feast of San Gennaro in Little Italy, operating gambling games, extorting payoffs from vendors, and pocketing thousands of dollars donated to a neighbourhood church, until a crackdown in '95 by New York City officials. On April the 13th, 1986, Gambino crime family underboss Frank DeCiccio was killed when his car was bombed following a visit to Paul Castellano, loyalist James Falia. The bombing was carried out by Victor Amuzzo and Anthony Casso of the Lachaise crime family, under the orders of Mr. Gigante and the Lachaise boss Anthony Corallo, to avenge Castellano and Thomas Bilotti by killing their successors. John Gotti also planned a visit Faella that day, but cancelled, and the bomb was detonated after a soldier who rode with DeCiccio was mistaken for the boss. In January 1987, Mr. Salerno was sentenced to 100 years in prison for racketeering, along with top members of other New York families as part of the Mafia Commission trial. Mr. Salerno had initially been billed as the boss of the Genovese family. However, shortly after the trial, Mr. Salerno's longtime right-hand man, Vincent the Fish Cafaro, turned informant and told the FBI that Mr. Salerno had been a front for the real boss, Mr. Gigante. FBI bugs had captured a conversation in which Mr. Salerno and Capo Matthew Matty the Horse Lananio were reviewing a list of prospective candidates to be made in another family. Frustrated that the nicknames of the wannabes had not been included, Mr. Salerno shrugged and said, "I'll leave this up to the boss." Mr. Gigante was reclusive and almost impossible to capture on wiretap, speaking softly, echoing the phone, and even at times whistling into the receiver. Genovese members were not allowed to mention Mr. Gigante's name in conversations or phone calls. When they had to mention him, members pointed to their chins or made the letter C with their fingers. After the imprisonment of John Gotti in '92, Mr. Gigante came to be known as the figurehead Capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses, despite the position being abolished in 1931 with the murder of Salvatore Maranzano. From 1978 to 1990, 4 of the 5 crime families of New York, including the Genovese family, rigged bids for 75% of the $191 million, or about $142 million, of the window contracts awarded by the New York City Housing Authority. Installation companies were required to make union payoffs between $1 and $2 for each window installed. In 1988, Mr. Gigante had open heart surgery. On May 30th, 1990, Mr. Gigante was indicted along with 4 other members of the New York crime families for conspiring to rig bids and extort payoffs from contractors on multi-million-dollar contracts with the New York City Housing Authority to install windows. He attended his arraignment in pajamas and bathrobe, and due to his defense stating that he was mentally and physically impaired, legal battles ensued for 7 years over his competence to stand trial. In June 1993, Mr. Gigante was under indictment again, charged with sanctioning the murders of 6 mobsters and conspiring to kill 3 others, including Gambino boss John Gotti. At sanity hearings in March 1996, Sammy the Bull Gravano, former underboss of the Gambino crime family, who became a cooperating witness in '91, and Alphonse Little Al Diarco, former acting boss of the Lachaise crime family, tested that Mr. Gigante was lucid at top-level mafia meetings, and that he had told other gangsters that his eccentric behaviour was a pretense. Mr. Gigante's lawyers got testimony and reports from psychiatrists that from 1969 to 95 that he had been confined 28 times in hospitals for treatment of hallucinations, and that he suffered from dementia rooted in organic brain damage. In August 1996, senior judge of the United States District Court for the Eastern District of New York, Eugene Nickerson, ruled that Mr. Gigante was mentally competent to stand trial. He pleaded not guilty and had been free for years on $1 million bail. He had another cardiac operation in December 1996, and on June 25, 1997, his trial started, and he stood trial in a wheelchair. On July 25, 1997, after almost 3 days of deliberations, the jury convicted Mr. Gigante of conspiring in plots to kill other mobsters and of running rackets as head of the Genovese crime family. Prosecutors stated that the verdict finally established that he was not mentally ill, as his lawyers and relatives had long maintained. On December 18, 1997, he was sentenced to 12 years in prison and fined $1.25 million by Judge Jack B. Weinstein, a lenient sentence due to his age and frailty. Judge Weinstein declared that Mr. Gigante had been finally brought to bay in his declining years after decades of vicious criminal tyranny. While in prison, he maintained his role as boss of the Genovese family. On January 23, 2002, he was indicted with several other mobsters, including his son Andrew, on racketeering and obstruction of justice charges. Prosecutors accused Mr. Gigante of continuing to rule his family from prison, and that he used Andrew to funnel messages to the family. They also wanted him to be held responsible for causing a 7-year delay in Mr. Gigante's previous trial by feigning insanity. Several days later, Andrew was released on $2.5 million bail. Federal prosecutor Rosalind R. Maskovoff had planned to play tape showing him fully coherent, careful and intelligent, running crime operations from prison. Faced with this evidence, Mr. Gigante pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice on April 7, 2003, just hours before the trial was to start. Judge Leo Glasser sentenced him to an additional 3 years in prison. Mauskov stated, "The jig is up. Vincent Gigante was a cunning faker, and those of us in law enforcement always knew that it was an act." On July 25, 2003, Mr. Gigante's son, Andrew, was sentenced to 2 years in prison and fined $2.5 million for racketeering and extortion. New York Times organised crime reporter and mob historian Selwyn Rabb described Mr. Gigante's plea deal as an unprecedented capitulation for a mafia boss. It was almost unheard of for a boss to even consider pleading guilty. For instance, Andrew faced up to 20 years in prison had he gone to trial. Another provision of the plea agreement stipulated that any relatives who helped in his deception, including his wife, mistress and father Louis, would not be charged with obstruction of justice. Mr. Gigante died on December 19, 2005 at the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. His funeral and burial were held 4 days later on December the 23rd at St. Anthony of Padua Church in Greenwich Village, largely in anonymity. Since his death, his family has continued to live well. According to a 2011 report by Jerry Capisi, Mr. Gigante's relatives earn nearly $2 million a year as gainful employees of companies of the New Jersey waterfront. Mr. Gigante is portrayed by Nicholas Caprose in the 1998 film Witness to the Mob. In the 2018 film Gotti, Mr. Gigante is portrayed by Sal Rendina. The Law and Order episode Fascia e Fascia, first aired February 28, 1998, featured an aging mafia don claiming mental impairment, inspired by Mr. Gigante. Mr. Gigante is also portrayed by Vincent D'Onofrio in the 2019 TV series Godfather of Harlem. The story of the FBI investigation into Mr. Gigante was depicted in Season 1, Episode 6 of the FBI Files documentary show, titled The Crazy Don, which first aired on December 8, 1998. National Geographic aired a 6-part documentary series, Inside the American Mob, where Mr. Gigante features prominently in Episode 5, The Rise and Fall of Gotti, while actions attributed to him are discussed in Episode 3, New York-Philly War. So, what are your thoughts on the crimes committed by Vincent Gigante? Please let us know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, stay safe.